thinking about our criminal court judges. There's 6 of them. 5 of them are women now. And I think there are more, the majority of judges in the Metro Courthouse are women. And a lot of that has to do with Margaret. One thing she, and she has worked in electing women, but I never want her to forget her first foray into politics when she decided that Metro needed a new public defender, and I was a beneficiary of her talents. She, like Ashley, has received the John Toon Award, which is the highest award given by the National Bar. In addition, she's received the ABA Margaret Brent Award, which is an award given to women of notoriety and commitment every year, to Justice O'Connor, Justice Ginsburg, and our own Sissy Daughtry, as well as Margaret. And here, just recently, she is the moving force behind the women's vote room at the public library to commemorate the passage of the 19th Amendment here in Nashville. And I can't wait to hear her cross-examine Ashley. Now, Ashley, who worked in legal services, we sort of came together, but actually, Ashley, I think, became a clerk 3 months before I became a clerk, and he's the one who said, gee, they've got an opening, Walt, you should come on. So 3 months later, I came along as a student. And then he was there for 6 years before he became the director in 1976 and served for 31 years. And what an extraordinary career. And if I could say, and other people here, that we were here for the birthing of legal aid, he certainly brought it into adulthood, and has the continuity, the excellence is all for him. The only complaint I have about his book is that he understates the role that he took. Unlike Winston Churchill, who wrote history, and he was the main character and hero of his book, Ashley has really downplayed his importance to legal services. He, as I mentioned, received the Toon Award. He's also had the honor of the Tennessee Bar Association naming its Public Service Award the Ashley T. Wilkshire Public Service Award, which is given each year to a notable lawyer. And another amazing award he received, maybe the biggest one, is he was awarded the Alum of the Year by Washington Lee, that famous liberal institution. So it's really, I did run across this, and this will be the end of it. Since we're here for the Between Two Ferns, now Margaret, listen up. I got this off the internet. Oh, no. The interviewer maintains a very awkward and often antagonistic demeanor with their guests, asking them bizarre, inappropriate, or insulting questions mixed with offhand non sequiturs. The guest responses are mostly improvised despite pre-interviews. Episodes often include a segment in which the interviewer or the interviewer awkwardly interrupts his guest to promote a sponsor's product. And here it's perfect. We've got the product. And this very good book about the history of legal aid. So I introduced the two of you, and I'm looking forward to Margaret's cross-examination.
goes red. If I talk.
There you go.
Turn it down. Okay, got it. Thank you. Well, that was a great introduction, and for most of it, your friendship for both of us shone through, but not all of it. It is great to see so many people who love legal aid here tonight in support of Ashley. Ashley and I, like Walt, had to go on the internet to see what Between Two Ferns. I didn't get that far, as Walt did. But Ashley says, "You need to, this is a theme, Margaret." And I go, "Oh, really?" So then you need good luck. So I did. So we have our celebrity, but I don't think it's going to be like Walt described. You know, this is an amazing book. Everyday Justice, a legal aid story. And I know when you read it, you're going to see yourself in here, and you're going to see the years, and you're going to think about what we have experienced. And thank you, Ashley, for doing this. I mean, 350 pages, and it's just amazing. So thank you. So how long did it take you to write this book?
6.5 years.
Let's see. Did you turn it?
It's
It's okay. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
6.5 years. Started it in April of 2016. And Pat Rulon and I, or Pat, submitted the last thing after she had translated countless yellow pages from me. She submitted the last thing to the Vanderbilt Press on November 16th of 2022.
So, you know, this book has lots of heroes and villains too. I mean, it's like a historical novel, but it's not a novel. I mean, you tell the truth. But how, from 1969 to 2002, do you remember all of this? I mean, there's so much in this book.
Well, I didn't remember. I had lots of help, and I encourage you to read the acknowledgments, because there were a lot of people who did a lot of reminding and a lot of sending these stories and correcting stories that I had dreamed up. And the website, I've sent somebody about it, newspapers.com, as I said in the acknowledgments, brought the stories mainly out of the Tennessean. And for all that time, the Tennessean was a great supporter, both editorials and stories. And Kirk Loggins, who just was writing about us all the time. Kirk, who's unfortunately now near death, he covered the state courts, Pat Welch, the federal courts, Judge Crenshaw, and so it was there for the picking. And so fortunately I didn't have to remember.
Why'd you write this book, Ashley? Why'd you write Everyday Justice?
Well, the short answer is because Gordon Bynum told me to. He came out to see me at the farm in the end of April in 2016, and we visited about a number of things, and then sat on the porch watching Yellow Creek flow north, and he said, "You've got to write this because otherwise it'll all be lost, because nobody will remember these things." And so that's why I wrote to preserve really the wonderful stories, both the big important history or publicized cases and also the small ones. The everyday cases that we handle. At one point, when the Commissioner of Welfare was complaining about us filing yet another class action lawsuit against him, Pat Welch called up Walt and me, and Walt talked about a case that he was handling, and I said, I've got 350 horses myself, and we're not just doing class actions. I mean, and that, you know, that's sort of the way it was. And so to sort of preserve that
You've done that.
but then all these, I mean, there were so many people here, I, you know, if I start naming names, I'll leave it as a that. But all these people handled year after year, day after day.
Now, this has taken some pride for me to get Ashley to talk about this, and that is about himself. And so,
Look at that.
look at this expression. But where did you come from? Tell me about your mother and your dad. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to college, seminary? How'd you, so tell folks about this who might not know this about.
Well, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. And it was during the time of segregation. I went to Dugdale, which was all white male campus. But there was a religion professor there who sent me to seminary in New York, which was a great thing, not only for the education I got, but also because it was in New York that I met Susan, who was across the street
Susan,
in Columbia.
just make sure everybody sees you.
And so consequently, we have our son Matthew, some of you may know of, and our daughter Carrie, who's sitting right by
Carrie.
Susan. While I was there was a guy who was there named Charlie Sherrod, who came for a sabbatical. Charlie Sherrod and John Lewis were on the losing end of the SNCC coup that happened just about 30 miles west of here. And where Stokely Carmichael and others who subscribed to the idea of black power took over in a midnight coup. And Charlie Sherrod, everybody was trying to get him to just have black folks working in his project in Albany, where he had gone in 1962, and where he stayed until his death in October of last year. I mean, talk about a lifer. He and Charlie had this student interracial ministry group come down, and he didn't mind having white kids work with him. And so that we worked there. I was there only briefly, and that's all. But that's what convinced me to be a lawyer. That the lawyers, law students, and lawyers who were there were getting a lot more done than we were. And so I went back and finished seminary, went overseas and taught for a couple of years, but then wanted to come back to the South, and so came. I applied to law schools only in the South, and fortunately got into Vanderbilt. And after the spring of my first year, I was looking for a job. I wanted to work in Appalachia, Neil. I thought that was my calling, but nobody answered my letters and nobody gave me a job. And so I finally, in April, came downtown, and Jerry Black, who you know, hired me on as a summer clerk. And that was, 52 and some years ago. But now I'm going to violate, don't recognize people. I was there, I started in June of 1970. But and Walt started in September. But before us, there was someone there who had started in September of the year before, and that's David Tarpley.
David,
who
stand
started. At Legal Aid, or Legal Services of Nashville, in September of 1969, and is still there. Record will never be broken.
So, Ashley, what was it like in those early days when you first got to legal aid? I mean, you were still a law student when you got there, right?
Yeah, it was pretty chaotic for the first few years. I mean, we had 4 directors and, or how many directors did we have? 4 directors in 5 years or something like that. And it really was. But at the same time, we were filing significant lawsuits. I mean, significant federal lawsuits, as well as, representing hundreds of thousands of people. What was my train of thought?
Well, I think it, for people who haven't read the book, and I know most of you got your copies that you pre-ordered now, just tonight, you sued judges too, right?
Yeah. Walt really picked that one up. They were putting people in jail for not being able to pay metro fines. And it ended up having to hold, Walt and others, having to hold one of the judges' contempt for violating Judge Morton's order, and so, but then once Walt became director, things really sort of straightened up, and that was sort of the beginning of a stable organization and some really aggressive advocacy on behalf of our clients.
Will you just address the two of your friendship, the friendship between the two of you, these advocates, using any tool you can find to make sure there's everyday justice? What's it like just being with Walt, doing this, like going after it?
Well, keeping up with Walt is not something that's very easy. I mean, he was there, but he was such a good influence on everyone who was there. And I mean, we've got a history.
Yeah, it's
and it's a wonderful friendship that for both of us.
You mentioned that you handle bigger cases, class actions and suing judges, but the everyday work that you did was also very much a part of what legal aid was like. You mentioned Gordon, and there's a reference in your book, and I would love for you to read it, about Gordon and a mule. And because in those days, legal aid took anything that came through the door. Anybody who showed up, you tried to help. So can you read this?
Now, this was before there was any priorities or any kind of allocation of resources or anything. And also Walt set up Thursday night interviews for people who couldn't get there during the day. So, I mean, and I think this case came in on Thursday night. And if you want to know a good list of these sort of everyday cases, read page 295. Kitty Calhoun lists the various kinds of cases that she handled in those early days. And it's just a rogues list of the things that legitimations and paternity cases and utility cutoffs and just everything. But and name changes. And so what I'm going to read is this story that follows a story about name changes. Filing name change cases had been common for us in those days. Filing with Clemens was not, but it fell to Gordon's lot to be asked to replevy a mule. An elderly man living in northwest Davidson County had a mule that he kept in a shed on his property. He used it to plow gardens and do odd jobs in the neighborhood. But unfortunately, the mule had a habit of getting out and making a meal of some of those same gardens. In retaliation, one neighbor locked the mule in his garage and refused to give him back. At which point, the mule owner came to see us for help. Unaccustomed as he was, Gordon filed a reclaimant action for the return of the mule, and he was successful. Case closed. But wait, not so fast. This was a persistent animal, stubborn as a mule. He got out again, and again a neighbor caught him, locked him up, and refused to return him. The mule owner came back to the smart young lawyer who had done such a good job for him before. This time, after a few moments of soul searching, Gordon decided he was going to make his own policy about case acceptance. We would replevy a mule once, but we would not replevy the same mule twice. Gordon's stubborn stand against taking the case would lead to some thoughtful consideration about priorities and case acceptance. Not only but also in the broader legal aid network, where demand was great and what case to take was a common issue. Soon after his experience, Gordon wrote an article for the NLADA Journal entitled, "How Many Times Must We Replevy a Mule?" Meaning for case acceptance priorities role with strategic direction. The mule became a rather homely part of a serious national discussion that eventually led to more legal aid organizations adopting case priorities.
Your book really talks a lot about community support, but there were a lot of obstacles and backlash to legal aid lawyers and what you were achieving on behalf of your clients. Can you first talk about what was the relationship between legal aid and the National Bar Association?
Well, initially, there's a chapter in here about the establishment of legal aid, and it was a difficult road. I mean, this was part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty and the Great Society, and that was not popular in the South. And mainly because it involved having black people and white people work together and also extend services to people who've never had those services before. And so it was very difficult for people, a number of people in the National Bar to accept this. It finally was put to a vote. There was a referendum in the Bar Association. And as far as I could tell, and I've looked back in the records back to 1914, there are only 2 times when there's been, at least in modern history, since World War II, been any kind of referendum in the Bar Association. I mean, mainly the Bar Board does the business, and you know, that's it. But the first was whether or not to integrate the Bar Association in 1965. And then the other one was whether or not to have a legal, that the bar, whether the bar would sponsor essentially legal aid. It passed 206 to 175. And that's when Darkenya, the next week, Harris Gilbert moved to establish the organization and became the first president.
There were a lot of times that you mentioned in the book that the bar was contacted about doing something about legal aid, or asked to investigate you, or asked to stop what legal aid was doing, and the bar helped steadfast, didn't it? I mean, there was opposition, but the bar really came to the front and stood up for legal aid.
Yeah, and a lot had to do with the leadership of the board. I mean, in the one particular case that you'll read in here, Brad Reed from this firm really was the bulwark against the committee had recommended that we be reprimanded for representing people at 12 Bottom Hospital against the state. And Brad essentially said, if you want to fight, I don't want to fight with the Bar Association, but if I must. And that, I think that stopped it. But there were a number of other people who.
Yes, many are in this room too, so you'll enjoy reading Ashley's remembering what you did to help legal aid. So the Carter years, 1976 to 1980, as you talk about them in the book, what was that like at legal aid?
Well, it was a time of great expansion. Neil McBride and Lenny are here from Oak Ridge, and Dave Kozlowski from Columbia, and those places established legal aid programs during the Carter years. And we grew to have 33 lawyers and a large and effective staff. And it was sort of the salad years.
So how did you manage all these people?
You know, any of you read Margaret Wrinkle's columns in the New York Times?
Yes.
Margaret, for those of you who don't know, is from Nashville, and she lives in Nashville, but she writes this weekly column in the Times. This week, she wrote about watching the sandhill cranes migrate. I wrote down the magnificent way they moved in concert. Well, that is the way on page 95 I described the way that legal aid moved under Walt and later, hopefully under my administration. That people would come through and evaluate us or study us and look for various structures and all this, and they wouldn't find it. But then they concluded, well, everybody seems to understand what they're supposed to do and why they're here. And okay, one guy called it implicit planning.
Well, for those of you who were around from 76 to 1980, I think we all can understand what Ashley just said. Just kind of moved in some kind of formation. But the morale was fantastic. You were a large part of that, Ashley, as to how you lead. So, but those years didn't remain, right? And then your book features the Reagan years and the challenges there and thereafter. Can you talk about what happened then with the change of the administration to legal services?
Well, it was a concerted effort to do away with the Legal Services Corporation, which was our main source of funding. And in the next 8 years, we went from 33 lawyers to 17. And it was just a time of crisis, and from one thing to the next. Now, I will say, and I say this in the book, that there was some silver lining because of two things that happened. And those two were the establishing of pro bono programs, number one, and number two, then in 1987, the establishment of the fundraising campaign, which has just really, I think, helped in building support and in making this a real community effort. And Chase Cole and others who have led that campaign, have really contributed to making this we're not gonna have the fights with the Bar Association that we had back in those days. I mean, this is something we're all doing together, and that, you know, that sort of came out of the really sort of hard times that we were having. And I mean, here's how hard it was, and Jenny Pegram was there in Murfreesboro. We really thought about closing the Murfreesboro office, and we just couldn't support it. And by gosh, the board wouldn't hear of it. I was in favor of it. Dick Lodge, who was board president, was in favor of it. The treasurer was in favor of it. The accountant, the servant in favor of it. And we took it to the board and said, no, if we leave, those people will never have confidence in us again. We can't desert them now. And my gosh, we stayed and really glad.
You know, before we get to contract with America and what happened with restrictions, I do want to ask you about, you mentioned throughout the book that racism was embedded, you know, into the system. And you make this quote, "You came to see the facility of waiting for a change of heart." And then just pressed on and led the organization, you know, to do something about this and change, given that so many of our clients were of color. Can you talk a little bit about that? You've done, you know, you've talked about what inspired you to go to law school and you know, your efforts there, but talk about the racism and what you saw being embedded in the system throughout your time at legal aid.
Well, it has to do, starting with my experience in Southwest Georgia, down in Baker County, living with a family of farmers, black farmers who owned their own land, and they were peanut farmers. But they could not get a fair allotment from USDA for enough peanuts to grow to support them, because the county committee was all white and farmers, and that was sort of my introduction to the connection between racism and poverty. And so, you know, we did have that Bill West case on housing discrimination that you worked on, Margaret, and Robert Greene did. And we did that, and then Gordon had a significant case that he lost about requiring the government to keep statistics on services to black people in health care, access to health care and treatment once a person got it. He lost the case, but some people in the Department of Health, what is it now, DHS, in the federal, somebody help. HHS, thank you very much. Some conscientious people, thank you, Michelle. Some conscientious people there picked up the ball, and what he had been advocating for, they carried forward. And so now people can keep statistics and see what's really going on in terms of adverse effect. And then the case that we mentioned about suing the judges was for, you know, putting people in jail for not paying metro fines. And you know, you can sit there in courtroom and you see who's getting it. So when Walt went and got his client out of jail after Judge Gray essentially told, was it Judge Washburn? Summers, sorry. And he released Walt's client. She came out of jail with black power.
It's not in the paper, right?
Right?
It's in paper, right?
On TV.
TV. So let's go forward now from the Reagan years and go into the 1990s, and when there is an effort to, as usual, stop the funding for legal services and there were compromises going on as to whether or not Legal Services Corporation, the federal corporation, the funding would even remain. And can talk about, if you don't mind, tell about how that came about and the compromise and where we are today with restrictions.
Well, that's why we have the Tennessee Justice Center, because the Congress severely limited what people could do who work for an organization funded by the Legal Services Corporation. Fortunately, the Legal Services Corporation survived. In the book, I described the process that we went through to determine that we would keep the Legal Services Corporation funding. And the helpful exercise that Frank Block put us through to realize we could still do 90% of what we were doing. But it was a bad time. It really was. It was sort of like the Southern Strategy, the 1996 version. The stories in the book about the lobbyists for NLADA who went and was talking to the staffers for Senator Kennedy. And Senator Kennedy wanted to do what he could to keep Legal Services Corporation funded, and but he knew that he had to compromise, and Julie Clark was trying to just push back the tide, and finally the staffer turned to her and said, "Julie, you represent, Julie, the two most unpopular groups in Washington today are lawyers and poor people. You're here advocating for lawyers for poor people." Figure it out. So that's that. The Legal Service Corporation survived, but there are limitations that are unfortunate.
And your book talks about, with those restrictions, class actions, lobbying, getting attorney's fees, and on. You have already alluded to this. Then you started to view legal services as a nonprofit, not just a law firm, but you view that you would have to go get resources other places. And the bar and others were a big help for that. So my time's up, your time's up. So I'll ask you one question. So there's still a national debate about equal justice for all. We're still having that, and what our country really gives people to get access to justice. So what advice do you give today to the people here in the room who are fighting for access to justice? What's your advice?
This is sort of a setup, because and thank you, Margaret, for doing this, and there's Dr. Kenyon and everybody else who made this possible. But we decided that the answer to this question, is the last paragraph in the epilogue. And I'm going to put on my glasses and read. And these limitations we just talked about. Nevertheless, regardless of the limitations or other frustrations today, the duty of the legal aid attorney in whatever setting, Legal Aid Society, TJC, TALS, wherever, is still the same it was for that legal services attorney many years ago. First, it is to stand by one's client, listening attentively and speaking respectfully, appreciating her plight and according to her the dignity so often denied to the poor and dispossessed. Second, following the admonition of Judge William Wayne Justice, and you'll have to read the book to find out about him. He's significant in the story. The lawyer must, in whatever form, tell the stories, present the revealing facts, convey the realities of poverty, advance the interests of the client, and prod the system toward justice. In that regard, follows the third imperative: to devise creative legal solutions, challenge the way things are, and when necessary, be that burr under the saddle.
I just want to wrap up by saying, Ashley, I mean, your fierce and courageous and steady leadership really made legal aid what it is today. And I was one of those lawyers in the early years that Ashley taught what he just read about. When he became director, I took over his cases. I was a newly hired lawyer. And so I can tell you that when he talks about dealing with someone with dignity, he certainly taught all of us that. Ashley is someone who doesn't think he's more important than anyone else. And so that means that everyone is as important as you are. And what happens as a result is you brought community and a sense of family to working at Legal Aid because of the way you led. And the second thing he talked about was telling stories. Well, that's exactly what he has done and given us. Telling the stories of legal aid, giving us the stories. But when he's teaching you as a lawyer, he is telling you, tell the story of poverty and figure out how you can promote justice while you're telling the story. And that is what you're going to get when you read this book. And thirdly, I think it's important to say that Ashley always understood that it was just not the judicial system, that it was all three branches of government that have to be incorporated in order to bring about justice. And, you know, he encouraged these creative legal solutions that you're going to read about in this book. It's amazing what legal aid lawyers do to get justice. And that is the kind of leadership that Ashley gave us. It gave us the confidence to be able to go out there and prod justice and be the burr under the saddle. You know, I asked Carlin Dodson, my husband, who's great at one-liners, how would he describe Ashley? And his said, Ashley made what seemed impossible normal. So, Ashley, thank you for the gift.